Boom, there we go. Welcome to the No Lifejackets podcast. This is episode 6 with Tim, who apparently is our regular guest on this particular podcast. So welcome back, Tim. At this point, I'll have some links down in the description for what we're doing, but just to give a quick intro to what we're rolling with here, we are reading The Year of the Frog. It's by a Slovak author, so we both read it. We're just going to kind of go over it. I'll try to put a link in the description for the books and other contact info like that. And as always, we have an email set up at brian@nolifejackets.com if you'd like to, contact us at any point. So, yeah. But Tim, thanks for coming on back. And you've got a little bit of context around this book to share.
Definitely. Thanks for having me again, Brian. And it's good to be back. It's good to be talking to you. And I like this new format. I like to read books as you do as well. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun into the future. So without further ado, let's talk about this awesome book. So the book is called The Year of the Frog by the author Martin Milan Šimečka. And this author is a particularly interesting person because he grew up as a child of dissidents in communist Czechoslovakia. Those dissidents, his parents were Czech, but they lived in Bratislava. So this author, he thinks of himself as a true Czechoslovak, really, or he thinks of himself as being, both in the Czech cultural context and in the Slovak cultural context as well. So he's home in both worlds, let's say. So this book actually was written in basically anywhere from 1980 to 1983. It looks like he was writing these little notes as sort of like streams of consciousness, and he then assembled it and he released it in what was called Asami, which was a piece of literature that came out during the communist times, which couldn't be published officially because it was either criticizing the regime or the author was in some way, wasn't conforming to the communist regime, and therefore he couldn't publish. So it came out like this in an underground newspaper. And after the fall of communism, it was published in English, assembled together, and it received a prize in the US. I think the prize is called Los Angeles News or Los Angeles Times prize, which is like a New York Times prize, but on the West Coast, I think. So it was supposed to be pretty prestigious back in the day. So, but yeah, so that's a little bit about the author and how this book came out. But I think to give a little bit of a historical comprehensive lesson here, I think we have to start in the 60s to really understand what this book is about. So the 60s were very different in the West and in the East. In the West, you've had hippies, you've had the Vietnam War, you've had psychedelics and John Lennon and all of that. While in the East, it was also like an age of liberalization. Socialism or communism, I will be using these two terms interchangeably. Socialism or communism was considered already built. So Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other countries in the Eastern Bloc were experiencing sort of like a political liberalization, let's say. So that was something that was in common with the West. There was this age of real liberalization, and it really peaked in 1968 in Czechoslovakia because the current communist or the then current communist leadership wanted some liberalization in terms of the political system as well. So the idea was, we're going to keep the communist regime in place. However, we want to give more freedom to travel for people, more freedom for the press to write what they want instead of just publishing propaganda essentially. And this was met with a lot of disdain from the Soviet Union. And shortly after these events of 1968, which are called the Prague Spring, we've experienced a backlash, a political backlash, which was then called normalization, because it was supposed to return Czechoslovakia to the normal, true communism again, no liberalization for you, Czechoslovakia. So the period of normalization lasted from the 70s, basically until the end of communism, until the fall of communism, for about
Gotcha.
20
Interesting.
years.
Gotcha. I actually hadn't picked up on that, that this was kind of, there had been a period where there was more liberalization back in 68, and this was kind of a backlash to that. Interesting. So it's almost, it would seem like, so would you say that the backlash was like a lot, like when I usually think of a lot of socialism and communism in the Eastern Europe back in
Mm-hmm.
the day, it's a very top-down hierarchical kind of setup. So it was kind of was it a situation where maybe like the individual countries and that were not necessarily like right, they're not the USSR, but they're very much related to them. We're kind of leaning in more of a liberal direction, and then it kind of came down from the USSR. Was that sort of top down sort of backlash, or do you think it was like kind of cultural
Mm-hmm.
from the bottom?
It was definitely top down, because what happened was in the 60s, or by the end of 60s, there was like a real there was like a real mood for change in Czechoslovakia's society. And however, so the changes, the nature of the changes was supposed to be such that the leading role of the Communist Party would be kept intact. However, what was to change was, again, no censorship for the press and all of that. However, the Soviet Union leadership with Leonid Brezhnev back then didn't like that, because they thought if Czechoslovakia undergoes this liberalization of politics, they will actually, so communism there will actually collapse. And they were afraid, Czechoslovakia would then join the West. It was the first country to be doing so if that were to happen. So,
Gotcha.
but
So
yeah, to explain,
a bit of like a domino effect, because we talk. It's interesting
yeah,
because when we
yeah.
talk about history here from the U.S. side, that's talked about the exact same way during like say Korea and Vietnam. The idea was, hey, we need to go in here and
Mhm.
stop communism, or else it'll spread across the world like a plague. Like it's interesting how that's almost it's a very similar view of things from completely opposite political directions.
Right. But just yeah, exactly. That's a good observation actually. Uh, but one more thing. So the countries in the Eastern Europe, or what we now call the Eastern Europe, we don't like to be called Eastern Europe. We're Central Europe.
Oh, gotcha.
But yeah, but that's just a linguistic toy to differentiate us from our communist past, I think.
Gotcha.
Anyways, so the countries in the Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, for example, were part of the Soviet bloc. So we weren't part of the Soviet Union, but we were part of the Soviet bloc, which was basically it was the ideological alignment with the Soviet Union, and it was much more top down than let's say the ideological alignment of, I don't know, Germany or France with the United States. Let's say much less top down. Like, if France wanted to undergo some form of I don't know, some form of a political reform, it was unlikely that the U.S. would just come and smash France
Yeah.
and and smash that reform with that, unless it was a communist reform. I don't know what would happen then.
Yeah, in the '60s, who knows? I suppose you never know in the
Oh
'60s,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah, maybe I don't
yeah. I
know.
mean, I doubt it.
Yes.
Like, there's still a very strong, I'd say, like isolationist bend to a lot of the United States. As
Hmm.
much as a lot of
Yeah.
people in power can be pretty hawkish on wanting to send troops and assistance everywhere all the time.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
it's really baked in to a lot of different cultures in the U.S. It's just like, hey, we're over here. It's all good. We have the biggest oceans in the world separating us from almost everybody who would possibly try to hurt us. We're good. but
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. This is
nice.
part of the criticism that also undergoes, or is pointed towards the United States when people say that, oh, the United States doesn't get the existential dread that other countries get from their neighbors, because the U.S. has very peaceful neighbors. So,
Hmm.
the, uh, anyways, but one more thing I want to say about the age of this book. So it was the 80s, right? The US was, um, I think Ronald Reagan was president. It was the Coke era in the States, and
Oh yeah.
it was republicanism was in its high tide. But over here in Europe, or in the Eastern Bloc, uh, it was very much thought that communism would be here for a long time. It was a running joke here, and people said, "So how long is going to? How long do you expect communism to last?" And people said, "Oh, communism is not going to last. The only question is whether it will end in 200 or 400 years." Yeah. So that was the sort of scale
Hmm.
people thought of when they even began to think about the end of communism. And lo and behold, less than 10 years after this book was written, communism collapsed, and people just didn't think that would happen in their lifetimes. My mom once told me that, because she grew up in the 80s, obviously,
Hmm.
she once told me that, if someone told her that I would be studying in the United States for a period of 1 year during high school, she wouldn't just believe it. It was simply unthinkable, unfathomable for them. It was like going to Mars, she told me. So this is the sort of age this has been written in.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, and just to look it up to add a slight bit of context here, just around the publishing of this.
yeah.
So it's like I was trying to think of some sort of equivalent in kind of a U.S. context for this, and there's not
Hmm.
much of one, but the close would be like sort of very much self-publishing, right? The printing
Hmm.
access and all of this back then, um, in Czechoslovakia was very much restricted, right? If you to get access to do any sort of large scale printing, you had to have specific access and like registration for your printer, right? That's kind of the area in which this was written. So a lot of this it could be handwritten, typed up at home on a typewriter. Someone had it, and it was literally just passed around from person to person, right? You'd get these sheets of paper, you'd read them, and you'd pass them around. So it was very underground with how these were first done, and I say that to give a little bit of context to the first point I wanted to bring up here. And Tim, you and I talked about this a little bit um,
Hmm.
previously, but I was surprised by how, for something that was written in a very underground context during a very heavy top-down cultural censorship sort of time, um,
Hmm.
that it's not necessarily the book itself isn't very like blatantly critical of of the government per se, right? It kind of has vague things about the state, and the book itself is very cynical, right? And so you could say that that's definitely, like, I would say probably the most kind of visceral critique that it has is just kind of the overall tone, and how you can see how growing up in his situation led him to be so cynical, especially since it's such an in like an introspective book, um,
Hmm.
where he's just constantly talking about his own thoughts. So I just thought it was super interesting that this isn't just a blatant, anti state propaganda book, but was kind of just that's kind of like a tertiary plot point, but not a ton.
Yeah, definitely. This is something that's very much present in the book, and perhaps kind of surprisingly. But I think that we have to consider that the author was like 23 or 25 when he wrote this, so even the regime was touching him only marginally back then at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it the biggest the biggest thing that was present in his life when or the biggest what the biggest element of presence of communism in his life was the fact that he was denied his studies. So if you were he was since he was a son of a dissident, he couldn't study. If you were in some way uncomfortable for the regime, there was no way you were getting to a good high school, let alone university. So he was kind of bitter about that, and because he thought that the regime took this away from him. He thought that he was denied this just because his father was a dissident. So it was like a so in turn, what he did was he escaped this prison of a regime into his own internal world. That's what happened. That's how I see it. I think that's why he writes so much about his own thoughts and his own internal. It's his internal dialogue that goes on in the book. So to eliminate the external, he went internal.
Interesting. Gotcha. That makes a whole lot of sense to me. Like, just, as someone who's like like at points I've gone through through depression and things like this. And when I was reading this book, it was kind of bringing me back to a lot of that. Like, when you're in a deep depression, like just the heavy cynicism, and you view like everything and everybody else's actions as some sort of game almost that's out of your control. It like all sorts of authenticity, and like if someone tells you something, you think in your head like, this is why they're saying that, right? They barely have any control over this. This is why they're saying that. So I definitely get a lot of those same elements out of it, and I think it's really, really powerful when he writes about it. I did probably just add a little bit of context for the book once again. So you mentioned his dad was a political dissident. So his dad's been carted off to prison somewhere. He grows up, and he can't compete in sports like he wants to. He can't go to university like he wants to. And that's kind of the context where all of this book takes place. And the book's actually, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but it is autobiographical. So it's very much based off of the author's life. Martin Šimečka, or you can probably pronounce it better, but
yeah, Šimečka.
Gotcha. Yeah, so his so this is all based off of his life, and like reading through it, like it kind of blows your mind a little bit, like how varied his experiences are, and how almost like, obviously he's telling the narrative, so there might be a little bias here, but almost every experience that he has just feeds into this cynicism and kind of the depressive state of the book even more. Like like he goes and he gets a job as a surgical orderly. So his job is sitting there while people cut people open. And there's descriptions in this book, and I'm like, he clearly had to actually have this job. So I looked it up to make sure, but yeah, he actually had this job because he's describing these medical procedures very matter-of-factly, like, hey, this is how it works.
Right.
And the imagery that he can get across from doing things like this, and just how it kind of translates to his own state of mind, and kind of as an allegory for the culture at the time overall, it's super powerful. But like, working there, even working at the hardware store, and his experiences there that were kind of feeding into this cynicism, like almost every part of his life is going in this general direction, aside from his relationship with Tanya. Excuse me.
Yeah, like it's the part of where he worked in this surgical ward or whatever it was. That was a harsh one. I think what struck me about this part was how cold everything was, how cold everything seemed. The hospital should be a hospitable place.
It's right in the
name. Yeah, and this seemed just like a very cold, harsh place. Very matter of factly, these people were just dying there. And he had a good friend there. She wasn't a doctor, but she was a nurse, right? Yeah. She had this friend there who he fell sort of platonically in love with, but in this woman, he described her as almost a man, huge hands and strong, powerful body, and she could, yeah. it was very cold. Like she even when she told him that someone died in the ward during the night. Um, it was very cold, I think.
Hmm.
This is one of the, I don't know, like it struck me as if the human that lay there had zero to none value of like individual value, was just meat on the table. It
Exactly.
struck me like that. Yeah.
It's super interesting. It's almost like I think like one of the like the most powerful thing in this book is just how introspective it is. So you can see his mind, and you're also getting these hints of how either his experience or like the culture and things and activities around him have kind of shaped this mindset. And so then you kind of take how he's experiencing this, and you can kind of almost draw a straight line back to how this is sort of representative of the overall culture. Maybe this is a response to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yep. Yep.
just the idea that necessarily one individual doesn't necessarily matter, right? When you zoom out and you're looking at this from a very communitarian point of view, where
Yep.
everything's for the good of society and the community at large. Um, this is kind of where stuff like this can lead, right? And like I worked at a nursing home for a little while and stuff like that, and I can see how working in a situation like that, particularly in a ward where people are dying every day, it could
Mm-hmm.
definitely desensitize you to it a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's really interesting, like the lines that you can always draw back from his point of view and how he's experiencing this to like, hey, maybe this is a problem with how we're looking at things like this in society right now. So it's it's a very like how do I describe this? It's a very like it's not vague. It's a very subtle way to make a very powerful statement. Like it's not
Yep.
coming out and banging you over the head with anything like this, but it's very, very subtle way.
It's like in the movies when they try to show you through image. They try to show you an idea through image. This is similar, I think. You have to read between the lines to really understand what he was saying. And he really was criticizing the regime in a sense with this, because it's as if he was, as an individual, looking for a way to channel this individualism, I think, in a collectivist society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Something like that, you know?
that's an excellent point. Yeah, because you can kind of right when you that's really interesting. So it's like if you're a relatively like I'd say you can probably link it to some sort of personality type thing, right? So if you're say a very
Hmm.
creative, expressive person, then you're probably and you're in a collectivist society. I feel like um, you'll be pretty pulled towards. What's a good way of saying this? You'll be pretty pulled towards some sort of individualism, right? But when you're not allowed to express that in your society necessarily,
Yep.
right? At least in a way that you normally would, um, you could definitely get pulled just straight into your own mind. That's a very interesting point. I think that's 100% correct. That kind of
Hmm.
being pulled into your own mind and saying, "Hey, this is the only way I can express myself." Writing stuff down on these sort of underground publishings. That's really interesting. That's a good point.
Yeah, and he even said this in the book. He said that, or maybe it was another book I read by by him, but he said that I just want to write. I just want to write and publish. That's all I want. Even if I have to live in destitute, that's all I want to do. And by the way, after the end of communism, this author, he became like a huge public intellectual in Slovakia, and he knows all these American authors. He knows Timothy Snyder. He knows Timothy Gartnash, who's British. He knows Tony Judd, who died. Great public intellectual, great intellectual historian. So he knows all these great minds, because after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and after the collapse of communism, there was this sudden strike of interest of the East, of the Eastern element in Europe. And yeah, so that's how he actually could publish and could become what he wanted all along. But he had no idea this would one day be the case. If you lived so living as a dissident in communist time was no joke. You could be jailed. You basically couldn't work. good jobs. You had to stick to like the low part of the economy. Yeah, so it was no joke, and many. That's why just a few people did it. Actually, that's why many people were fine with it, because they wanted to just live their life. And if you wanted to live your life and all you had to do was agree with the regime, well then fuck it, you're gonna agree with the regime.
Mm-hmm.
But so this was like a real, being a dissident back then was a real expression of courage, I'd say.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that
Anyways.
idea a lot, and I think it kind of leads into how like it's a very I'd say it's probably a very honest portrayal of what it's like to live in something like this, right? Because like, say, like a lot of books that are sort of on this topic, right, along the idea of like living in an authoritarian society, right? The idea is that always, oh, there's an authoritarian society that exists here. Clearly, this movie or book has to be about overturning it completely and how horrific it is, right? Or something like 1984, where it's very blatant and over the top how um, how this power is exercised from the top down and how horrific it is. And that's not necessarily the case in
Mhm.
this book, and it's probably not the case in real life, right? Because people are still going to have to actually live in this society. And even having some ideas against it isn't necessarily going to be like the worst thing in the world, right? It's not necessarily that you're living as a secondary citizen who's constantly being spit on in the streets or something like that. Um, but I think it's just very honest to say, hey, here's how it is, and he keeps drawing those lines between like I think his mental state back, and that's just it's such a it's a very honest way to talk about actually living in something like this instead of going over the top and kind of
Mhm.
exaggerating and doing things like that. So I definitely appreciated that around as well. Let me quick. I think I'm going to pause the recording here because I just realized that I need to fix my Zoom license or get one or something, or else we're going to run out of meeting time here. So let me pause this quick. And
Let's.
we're back, having successfully fixed all of our technical issues as the IT professional that I am. Didn't take any time at all, I assure you. All right, so back to our points. Let me pull another point off my list that I have here, so we can kind of jump back in here. Um, I wanted to talk about. So I'm curious. Did you read this in? Did you read the English translation, or did you read in the original Slovak?
I've read it in the original. I couldn't get my hands on an English translation here,
Gotcha.
but yeah, I've read it. Yeah.
Sounds good. And am I right that it's written in Slovak?
Yes. Hmm.
Okay, gotcha. So I.
Except for the part with where the American is, Sam.
Oh yeah,
No, that's partly in English. So
interesting. That's cool. I like it when there's
yeah,
little touches like that. Um,
yeah.
so I loved like just the prose, like the way it was written, like the stream of consciousness. He's obviously a very talented writer. Like obviously he wrote it when he was really young. But so maybe
Hmm.
some of the like total structure overall for the story, probably like it's a different type of story, but the like just because he's in this place of heavy introspection, you really need a lot of you kind of need to have a very artful prose style of writing to really keep
Hmm.
people drawn in, since he's doing just like most of these just thoughts off his head. And a lot of like the analogies he makes and just the way he writes a lot of this stuff was really well written. And I'm curious if you thought that was the case in the original translation as well, or if he just had a really good translator.
It's true. It's true for the Slovak one as well. I think it's very interesting to see how he thinks about the world through his words, right? It's because this language that he's using, it's just uh, it's just about the best window to his soul that you can get, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, the things he notices in the world, the things that he speaks on when he so for example when he's running, he goes into incredible detail about
Hmm.
every sort of thing that you experience when you're a runner, and you really want to squeeze every last drop of
Yeah,
power in your body.
it's very it's such great writing in that like a rule for writing a lot since I because I write some short stories as well, and the rule that
Hmm.
you always want to follow generally is show don't tell, right? So
Right.
you don't want to tell someone, hey, this guy really likes running, right? Now, but like he's like multiple times in this book, he's describing himself running, and he's just going for it, and he's making analogies about different parts of his bodies, and it's like it's relating through the environment he's going through, and it's all just really, really descriptively well written, and I never felt like a hint of him like realizing he needed to get a point across to you and just telling you that, right? It's always these
Right.
descriptions, it's always stuff like that, and I think like I think that's probably the biggest like writing takeaway that I took from this book is just like
Hmm.
tons of examples of how you can do that. Show, don't tell. It was awesome.
Yeah, you're dead on the money there. I think he really is a master of, because descriptions can be boring sometimes. You're
Mm-hmm.
describing environment or whatever. It can be boring, but what he manages to do, I think, is he manages to slip these ideas into that description, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the description is no longer just a description. It carries ideas as well. So when he's running, he's describing how he's getting sick from his stomach, and everything is burning and all of that. But then he has like a great idea pops into his head, and he manages to uh, get that into that description of his run. Like by the end of one of those chapters, he's realizing that he's really in love with Tanya, and he probably couldn't live his life without her. And I think that's like a point of no return, and it really is shown in that visceral image of him running through that forest, and just squeezing every last drop of himself in that run, and having this um what how do you describe it, this great
Uh,
eureka moment,
yeah,
discovery,
epiphany. That's the word.
epiphany.
Yeah.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah. Epitaph, no, not epitaph, epiphany.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, you got a specific point you'd like to jump to next?
Sure,
Huh?
sure. Yeah, I've written some points down as well. And what really struck me about this book is despite the harshness of that regime, despite the harshness of the life and the things that he had to endure, as a result of being on the other side of what communism wanted, he manages to paint a picture of a simple life. Of this book is like it's really light in its thread. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
threading lightly. It's very like thin. In parts, it's of course it's cynical in its parts, but I think at the same time when he's describing the long summer nights and what
Mm-hmm.
they did over summer, and all of that, it was this incredible stillness of life that he manages to describe, and it's in real contrast to what we experience as young adults right now, I think, because
Yeah.
we are surrounded by this incredible amount of stimulation everywhere. Your Instagram, your Facebook, whatnot. The speed of life is really something else today, I think. And I think that there's a real contrast with what life was back then. I don't know if this is true for life in the 80s in the US as well, or in the West, but it seems like life was simpler and more still back then, and you can really appreciate these little things that you encounter
Definitely.
every day.
Yeah, I'd say that it's not necessarily that I don't think it's necessarily true that like life is different, but I think with all these stimuli that you're talking about with social media, and if you want to hear something, there's someone who's gonna agree with you, someone who's
Hmm.
gonna disagree with you, probably 50 of each out there, varying levels of success, and you can just al- always bombard yourself, right? I'll be like it's so heavy that I'll be like, oh, I gotta go to the bathroom, and I'll like pick up my phone and start looking for a YouTube video to watch while I take a shit. Right? It's like,
Yeah.
why? What's wrong with me? There's so much stimulation
Yeah.
that it convinces you, it's tricking you into thinking that all of these things are important when none of these things
Yeah.
actually matter. Right? Like in
Yeah.
that moment, it's so important I'm constantly stimulating myself or trying to educate myself or learning.
Yeah.
And it's tricky because sometimes there are good things, right? You're learning more, you're educating yourself, but it tricks you into thinking that all of this really actually matters. And I think to a certain point, what he was kind of doing in the book, like he's talking about these heavy, dark, cynical subjects a lot, but like you say, he almost talks about them in a light way, and maybe the cynicism sort of lends to that, in that it's like he's talking about all these things, and in the end, maybe it's not necessarily all this heavy, dark cynicism that matters. He's telling you what happened throughout the day, and that's kind of ends up being what matters, right? He went for a run, he went to the beach, he had a great time camping, stuff like that. And I think, yeah, I think you're probably right that back in the 80s, it definitely was simpler just because you didn't have as much access, and so maybe it was easier to see that none of this really matters. Do you need to be caught up on all the breaking news, constantly glued to your screen? Probably not. But I think we've just been tricked into thinking that life is so different because of all of this. We have such a hard time saying, listen, this really isn't that important to me, because it's like, oh, but don't you care? Like, there's, it's really heavy, but yeah.
And it's harder to unplug from all this, I think, because
Hmm.
it seems like the age we live in demands it, right? I don't know if this is a false notion, but it really seems like the age demands it. You have to be up to speed with all the matters of the world, basically, right? And it can be heavy, and like the first advice you get from psychologists, I think today, is like unplug for a while. Like you don't have to
Hmm.
you don't have to bury yourself in all this content. Ironically, we are adding to it right now, but
Right now, yeah. For all those people listening to this on the toilet, just keep on listening.
yeah. So there was something. Also, something that surprised me was how easy it was to get a job.
Right?
It was.
I was I was reading that, and it was like the cops come up and they're like, "Hey man, you don't have a job," and he's like, "Yeah, I suppose I should get a job," and he just
Yeah.
goes and gets a job. I suppose maybe it was there, like, do you know if there at all was like some sort of like government thing? Really, it sounded
Yeah, it
very
was.
related to the government, like there was no private
It
transaction, sort of.
was.
Okay, gotcha.
So watch this. So it was actually illegal to not be working during communism. It was illegal. You had to be working. You had to be contributing to the system. There was no way around it. You could be without work for 2 months. That's what he did during that one period of the book.
Hmm.
He abandoned his previous job for 2 months, and then he had to find a new one. Otherwise, you would be arrested and thrown into jail. So you had to be working. Yeah. And you know what this resulted into? Like, so the positive thing about this was everybody had a job. So
Yeah.
there was this sense of security. You're always going to have a job. The bad side of this is that overemployment was a real thing.
Hmm.
People were employed just for the sake of them being employed. And that ruins your economy.
Yep.
So essentially, so because you have to have that. Unfortunately, you have to have a certain amount of pressure, um, for existential pressure for you to move ahead and all of that. Because if you always have a job and you're guaranteed to have one because you have to have one, therefore you're guaranteed to have one. You don't really seek to better yourself in that job, or you don't
Hmm.
really seek to do your best, let's say, or so you sort of went into that job and you did your bare minimum. You collected your wage by the end of the month, and you lived
Hmm.
your simple life. Yeah.
Yep.
But that sort of system is perhaps more. I don't know. That's a good question. Is that system easier on the soul or not? Because you can make an argument that it actually isn't, because people are burden animals. We need burden um, to move ahead.
Mm-hmm.
we need to bear responsibility and all of that. So it actually, but yeah, but you could also make an argument that you're sort of living your simple life and you're contributing to the overall state, and your the outcomes, the products of your work get redistributed, and you're just living your simple
Definitely.
life.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like, there's a saying that I can't remember where I heard it exactly. It might have been years ago in like a Jordan Peterson video or something like that. But like, in the U.S. at least in particular, and probably I
Hmm.
assume that applies to like Canada and places like that as well. But it's very much a culture of a career, right? Everybody wants a career, right? You're gonna have a
Hmm.
job
Hmm.
that you're working towards, and you're gonna be working up the ladder and doing your best and stuff like that. And that's kind of what a career is. But most people don't have careers, right? They have jobs, right? And
Right.
kind of what you're mentioning here. A lot of people, they had jobs. You go in, you do stuff, you come out, and that's not necessarily a point of fulfillment for you or anything like that. It's just a way for you to get sustenance and stuff like that. Um, but I think because there are some people that will work really well for and some people that it won't, and I feel like a system like that, I think the biggest thing is just going to be overall productivity, right? I don't think you're going to have a very
Hmm.
productive workforce if everybody has a job, right? Because you're kind of
Yep.
demotivating some people who maybe would be motivated to work harder, um, and productivity. And I suppose there's probably actually statistics for this out there because economists are super nerds who probably recorded all of this stuff in the 80s. But I would almost be certain that productivity would drop massively. And it's kind
Yep.
of a thing of like the Soviet system in the time, maybe a little earlier than that is what I'm thinking particularly. But right, like, hey, this town, their job is a factory. If they're not producing enough, we need them to produce twice as much. We're going to give them twice as much resources, right? We're just
Yep.
going to take the inputs, jack them up, and go through it. The process itself is probably completely unchangeable. It's just a factor of what we put in, what out. It's an equal sign. It's an equation. We just need to put more inputs in, and it's kind of interesting. So I'm sure productivity
Yep.
is probably the big difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And if the job market isn't governed at least a little bit by the free hand, um, you end up with an unproductive economy. That's what you're mentioning exactly. So, and that's why a lot of industry that was here in Czechoslovakia, like Slovakia and Czech Republic, were very heavily industrialized. And after the collapse of communism here, a lot of those factories went bust because they couldn't compete with the Western standard, let's say, of productivity and all of that. So a lot of them went bust. It's not the only reason why, but it largely contributed to the fact.
Hmm.
So yeah, like once you had these two different economic systems competing against each other, while the other outcompeted the next one.
Hmm.
And once they joined each other on common ground, the communist one just couldn't compete, and it was a disaster.
Yeah.
Like '90s were a disaster. Part of the reason why '90s were such a disaster in the Soviet Union or in Russia, for example, was this. So
Gotcha. Yeah,
yeah,
it's almost a bit of an argument for globalization and kind of against a lot of isolationist stuff. And this is like
yeah.
the example that I heard most growing up for this exact phenomenon was Cuba, right? So Cuba was
Hmm.
like embargoed from U.S. trade and a lot of this stuff for like 70 years or something like that. And so I think finally in maybe it was the 80s after stuff fell, we kind of opened up a bit with Cuba for a bit, and like people were going down there and visiting, and it was like absolute insanity to some people. They like come back and we're like in the 80s now, right? Cars look like jet fighters. They're all very stylized and technology is huge. And then they'd fly down to Cuba and they'd see like what was the car's name? I think Trabant. There's a lot of these
Yeah,
cars. They're
Trabant, yeah.
they're just the worst cars ever made, and they're using them constantly all over the place. And it was kind of a bit of a big wake up call, because I think probably 90s and 2000s generally that period is where really the U.S. in particular opened itself up to a lot of globalization and stuff like that. And I think
Hmm.
like the Cuba example was a big reason.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So that's one thing. Like how easy he so what happened in the book was when Milan was approaching this 2 month period of no job, of unemployment, he walked into a hardware store once and he told the clerk, "I want a job," and the clerk sort of like measured him with his with his eyesight and said, "All right, well, you can start tomorrow." And that was that.
I love it. It was kind of blowing my mind. It was actually one of the points I wrote down. I was like, is this literally just a thing? Like you can just do that? Like I mean, for a lot of service jobs like that, maybe you can do it pretty quick over here in the U.S. nowadays as well. But
Yeah.
like just the idea that like you're entitled to a job is kind of like
Yeah.
it's very foreign.
Yeah, yeah. And it's, and a lot of people actually miss that. Like when you talk to old people
Mm-hmm.
in Slovakia or in Czech Republic, they miss that because they say, "Oh, you've had security and the existential dread that's present in a free market was gone." So I guess,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it's ultimately it isn't good for the state as a whole, and therefore it isn't good for the people either because progress is stagnating. And yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Gotcha. All right, let's see here. I'll jump into one of my points here. So what was it?
go
I
on.
thought what was really interesting about this one was so this was originally published as like a bunch of short stories and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
typically in short stories that I read, and probably the ones that I write as well, um, like the point of view character can have like a very singular and logical thought pattern, right? Because in a short story, often depending on the length, some really short ones maybe don't have this, but the idea is that you're trying to either like a change in the character's point of view or change in their situation in some sort of way, right? And so the story ends up being very focused in a specific area to say, hey, here's how the character was thinking, and they go through this change, and here you can see afterward how like their point of view has changed or situation has changed, things like that. And in these short stories, there wasn't a lot of that, right? Like if you just straight read through this story and you like didn't care much for the
Mm-hmm.
introspection, you'd probably think it was a pretty bad story, right? Like the plot points don't necessarily carry through. Like maybe even like the different sections don't have they don't connect in a specific way. Even like in the self-contained section, there's not necessarily like a point of view change or something like that. It's written in a very messy way, and I thought that was it's written in a very honest way, right? Like you're getting all of this guy's thoughts kind of as a normal human would have them, right? Instead of this sort of idealized narrative style that we read a lot where somebody
Mm-hmm.
maybe is looking back and saying, hey, this is clearly the story, so I'm going to reframe what happened here to emphasize that's how this went. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just extremely honest, and I was really surprised by that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, we've discussed this a little bit before. The way he writes, we agreed it was sort of like a direct stream of consciousness style of writing, because it seems as if he was just recording, and he was not only recording what was happening to him throughout the day or whatever, but he was also. It seemed like he was like a filter through which he let those events run through, and he reflected them back onto the paper. It wasn't
Mm-hmm.
just pure statement of facts. It was reflected through a point of view. So I imagine it as as these things are happening to you, the external world is channeling something against you as an individuality, and you sort of let some of that through you, and some of that is reflected, and and you record that process. And so I tend to think about his writing style as this. Yeah, and it's
Mm-hmm.
perhaps the reason why it's different, maybe, is that this was a guy who was just writing short stories for samizdads, for like these self-published underground newspapers, essentially. So he didn't really think of it as he didn't. I don't think he even thought that he would be able to publish it as a book
Yeah,
one
that's
day.
a good that's a good point. Like some of that honesty probably comes from not thinking that people are going to read it, right? So
Yeah,
like,
just like fuck it. I just need to record this. Fuck it, you know.
right? Like
Like,
he's completely writing it for himself, basically. Maybe a few other people. He's just gonna throw it out in the world. But
yeah.
it was never the idea like that he was gonna write it. Like if I'm writing something and I know like a million people are going to read it, right? That's gonna influence how honest I can kind of be about my own thoughts. And
Mm-hmm.
when I was reading it, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know if I could be this honest if I was like writing it.
Right.
And part of that's probably because I'd be like, well, obviously this book's been read by a lot of people, but like for instance, some of his like introspection when he's thinking about um like basically the concept of a woman, right? And how women are different from men and how he thinks about them. And I'm like, I would be scared shitless to try writing anything like this, right? That was just that introspective, right? If I wrote down something like that and it ended up actually being read by people, someone's gonna like clip out that section, be like, look at this dumbass. And then, and I'd run the risk of getting ostracized from everywhere because I wrote some weird shit that I was thinking about one time. And
Yeah.
I suppose maybe some of that's just kind of the culture we're living in at the moment, right? The kind of how things like that work. But I found that honesty just super refreshing, and it probably comes from not many people were probably going to read it, and maybe I suppose probably culturally things were a bit different back then. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah,
Yeah, that's dead on the money, man. Like, yeah, I think that's what makes this book really unique because you are undergoing a certain amount of self-censorship when you're writing some content that you expect other people to read. You know, you undergo this process of, you know, so one of the approaches that you can take when you're writing a short story or a book, you can sort of idealize yourself when you're, let's say, writing an autobiographical story. You can idealize yourself and your own thoughts, even, you know, even retrospectively. You're looking back and you can sort of consciously or subconsciously omit certain things, and that already is a sort of a censorship. Whereas here it was just recorded in a very, very honest way. Yeah, without, yeah, it's yeah. At some points, I was definitely like you were as well, like um, catching myself thinking, wow, you know, I couldn't write this myself. If I was writing this and expecting people to read it, I couldn't be so honest, I think. And especially when he was describing women or Tanya, let's say, and the way he understood love and all of that.
mm-hmm.
That was very honest, I think, you know. And I think it was really recording, the whole story was also recording the epiphanies a young adult has to go through when he's in his 20s or whatnot. You know, you have to go
Yeah,
through these.
definitely. I agree 100% with that. Like it's a very developmental thing when you're like considering what
Yeah.
you think about something or how you're approaching this, and like if you can figure out any like values underneath it maybe that like that are important to you. And like I feel like just by like I don't think for a lot of this it's very incentivized to kind of like look at and do it at least like nowadays, like I don't think like you'd have to be absolutely insane to like
Hmm.
write something like this nowadays and just go through your own thoughts when you're a 17-year-old dumbass, right? Because you're gonna write it, maybe you publish it somewhere, and some like 32-year-old who's actually semi-educated is like, yeah, this is a very toxic way of looking at this. Thank you. Like you can't. It's like, yeah, I mean, guy is 17. He's trying to figure this out. Maybe he
Yeah.
didn't come up with a perfect one, but it's I don't know. It's a little bit scary that like because when you're that young and trying to figure this out, you're not going to have the right idea about things, right? Like you're going to be very wrong. But I think, just trying to understand yourself and how you're thinking about something is super important, and not like, and that just not being incentivized a lot right now, I think is a huge problem.
Oh yeah. Yeah. That's definitely the case. Not being able to, because I don't like this notion, this phrase, but it's very much present in one way or another in in our culture right now, and it's, you know, this phrase of cancel culture. You know, you
Yeah.
tend to be, or, you know, there's these famous people who've written something stupid on Twitter 10 years ago, and there's this mob who finds that tweet, who find that tweet, and and
Hmm.
they cancel that person over that because they've said something stupid or homophobic or racist or whatnot. I mean, so it really doesn't incentivize like this free thought, because that's what free thought is, right? You say something stupid, and then maybe someone corrects you or you correct yourself. And there was this one case in the book where it was very much illustrative, where the author, he sat down and he was like, all right, I'm going to write something. And he poses himself a question. He asks, what am I? And the first word, the first phrase that spurs to mind is, I'm a piece of shit. And he writes that down. And
Yeah.
then he's like, this is not a good start. Not a very good start.
Yeah, it's really like, yeah, it's like I don't necessarily know what like I just don't think like, because in I feel like everybody wants to have like, yeah, we get this is a problem, right? We need to figure out the ideal solution, right? It's got to be out there. And I don't necessarily think that it is, right? And it's yeah, like being
Mhm.
able to be this introspective. There's you gain a lot by doing that instead of like I feel like the incentives right now would be to just to not think about these things, to listen to somebody else who has an audience and someone who has an Overton window of their own where all their ideas are here, and there's enough people behind it where you can be like, okay, if I think this, people won't think I'm crazy because a bunch of other people think it
Yeah.
too, and it's just dumb. Yeah.
I mean, it has its use, right? Because
Mhm.
in some sense, the culture keeps you in check,
Yeah.
with this. You can't just think to yourself that it's, I don't know, that it's fine to, shoot up a school or something like that. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah, like for example, if you're just sitting on your own in a cabin in the woods and you sit there and you're like, "Okay, I'm going to figure out what I think about eugenics." Right? Right? And I know,
yeah.
like I think if I sat down like in a cabin in the woods with no context for
Yeah.
people to check me and I wrote down, I could definitely like see myself coming to some conclusions and be like, yeah, I mean, I get it, right?
Yeah.
like, and you can see, like, in the past, that was a thing, right? That was where the Overton window was,
Right.
sterilizing people with Down syndrome and things
Yep.
like that. And,
Yep.
like, and if you're gonna in a cabin in the woods, not thinking about this, and nobody checks you, you could come to a
Yeah.
conclusion, and maybe internalize that, and it would become like a part of your identity, and that would be a massive problem. So there's
Yeah.
definitely
That's what
problems.
happened. That's what happened to Hitler with Mein Kampf. He wrote that book when he was in prison. So
Hmm.
that was probably the worst thing, the best thing they could do for him. Close him up and let him, let him dive into himself.
Yeah, people are always like, man, if you can go back in time, would you kill baby Hitler? I'm like, no, I'd get that man into art school. Let's do it. Let's. I'm gonna rig the process so Hitler gets into art school, and now we're living in a utopia. All right, this is the change we need to see in the world.
Jesus Christ.
uh, but yeah. All right,
Yeah.
you got another
So
point you want to cover?
sure. So let's doo-doo-doo. I've got a couple. Let's see. Yeah, I found when I go back to the point of stillness for once, I wrote down that it's this stillness that illustrates the enormity of individual existence. I think that, it's what I meant by this is, try to sit down and be with your own thoughts for a little bit. You're probably going to get overwhelmed pretty fast. So stillness can be paradoxically, it's not empty. Stillness is not empty. It's very much full of whatever comes up in your mind. And I think that the way that this book is at the same time heavy and light is is due to this fact that stillness, being, this lightness, this sort of ponderance, is light, while the enormity of your individual experience is heavy. So I think that's why this book is both light and heavy. um,
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of this paradoxical juxtaposition of meditation, or of meditative states, let's say. Yeah, so that's one of the points I've had written down. I think that's why it seems to both of us that this book is cynical and sarcastic and heavy, but at the same time it's kind of light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. Um, it's an interesting way of, right? Because when you're living in a collectivist society and you'd be saying things that are particularly individualistic, but just kind of the idea that kind of your thoughts and your actions and maybe even just going about your daily life here is kind of the
Hmm.
focus of this book, and your thoughts is itself kind of like an act of like protest um,
Yeah.
against what you're being in.
Oh
It's
yeah.
it's a huge act of individualism to say, hey, I'm considering maybe I'm considering some philosophical stuff, but it's also very much in the moment, right? Like when he's watching these surgical procedures, like
Hmm.
he's very in it, right? And he's focused on his experience of it, and that itself is kind of a huge expression of the individual on its own.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's in some sense writing under a communist rule or under authoritarian rule, let's say, is the only possible escape if you live in a collectivist society, because that's the only way you can really express your individuality, which is suppressed by the state. And what can you do if your individuality is suppressed by the state? You can't do shit. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's it's the enormous amount of pressure that you receive from the state is, yeah, it's really something. It really is. And I think when you're facing this external pressure, it sort of puts you into this cube of your own individual experience. And the only way, and that the pressure is increasing and that cube is getting denser and denser, and it wants to explode, and it can explode on paper. And that's
Nice.
perhaps something that happened here.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's 100% right. Oh yeah, so I was kind of curious. I wrote down a note here, and I'm
Hmm.
sure you can help me with this. I'm not particularly well versed in like Central European history here.
Hmm.
So during the writing of this book, it's still Czechoslovakia, right? Like Slovakia and the Czech Republic
Yes.
are one country. Okay, gotcha. And so when did those countries split? Was that like immediately following the fall of communism?
So 1989, beginning of November, I think it was like the 7th or 5th or whatever, the Berlin Wall collapses. Shortly after the Berlin Wall collapses, protests protests spur across the Soviet bloc. So the Berlin Wall is obviously in Berlin, that's in East Germany, communist state, and that was very much emblematic of a change coming. So the 17th of November of 1989, there was a huge demonstration both in Prague and in Bratislava, the capitals of Czech Republic and Slovakia.
Mm-hmm.
And these huge protests actually result into communists handing the rule over. And that's we call it the Velvet Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
because it was a coup d'état essentially, but it was a peaceful coup d'état. So the communists, they decided to hand power over to the protesting people, um, and nobody really knows why they did so. Because in other states, for example, with Romania, Romania had a huge bloody uprising, where when communism was falling there, and this is an interesting story. So the leader of Romania was called Ceausescu, and this guy Ceausescu, he's said to be the worst of communist leaders in Eastern Europe. And so what these people did to him was they captured him, and before they got the cameras rolling, the media was there as well when they captured him. Before they could get these cameras rolling, they shot him to death with many bullets.
I'm sure.
Uh, yeah, so they hated this guy, and this didn't happen here. Nobody went to jail essentially after communism fell.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of like a peaceful handing over of power. So that was 1989. Communism collapses. From that period on to 1993, beginning of 1993, Czechoslovakia was a federation. So up to that point, up to 1989, it was basically very much centralized political rule from Prague. But after the collapse of communism here, it was basically a federation, with Slovakia having being basically an independent entity
Mm-hmm.
within Czechoslovakia. So it was a federation. That lasted for 2 years, and the political turmoil of that time resulted into the splitting of Czechoslovakia. The reason we split was basically it was a political stalemate, and people say that if there was a referendum, Czechoslovakia wouldn't have split because neither the Czechs nor the Slovaks wanted to split. But the politics of that time just resulted into splitting. So we decided to split peacefully,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, Czech Republic became its own country on January 1st, 1993, and Slovakia became its own country on January 1st, 1993 as well. So there was a
Gotcha.
period of basically 2 years where we were a federation, and yeah, and it was.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think we should have stayed a federation, but we didn't. So
Gotcha.
that's
Yeah,
history.
because I know like when we went on our trip over there and stuff like that, like very similar. Like I know like the languages are slightly
Hmm.
different, and
Hmm.
stuff like that. Uh, is the Czech Republic in the EU?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. I just remember
Yes.
using different money there, so that was
Yeah, they
probably
use
that's good.
crowns. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
weird.
They
Okay,
don't use
yeah.
the euro. Yeah. So, yeah, the languages are a bit different. Not too much, but yeah, like a lot of our vocabulary is shared
Hmm.
and all of that. So I speak Slovak when I'm in Prague, and people understand no problem. And it's sort of a, yeah.
Interesting. Like you still use some different words, so it's not quite an accent, but like more of a
Yes.
dialect, maybe I suppose. Gotcha.
Yes. Yep. Yep. Let's say. Yeah.
Cool. Gotcha. All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious on that. Like, do you know? So historically speaking, like before communism and stuff like that,
Hmm.
was it kind of a combined culture as well, Czech Republic and Slovakia, or historically were they two different regions?
Little bit. Little bit. There's a lot of talk about this, obviously culturally. So before the okay, so let's talk 20th century. So with the end of the First World War, the first Czechoslovak state was created. So Czechoslovakia was created in 1918, and we call it the First Republic. That lasted until 1939, when the war started, and Czech Republic was annexed essentially by Germany, and Slovakia became an independent puppet state,
Mm-hmm.
and that lasted until 45. And in 1945, Czech Republic, or the Protectorate of Czechia and Moravia, which it was called back then. Um, yeah, so the Czech Republic and Slovakia reunited again in 1945, and uh, they were no longer a democracy, but
Mm-hmm.
fell under communist rule. So the first republic was actually democratic, and it was one of the only democracies in Europe at that time. So, for example, Czechoslovakia had voting rights for women in 1920, much sooner than UK, France, Switzerland,
Mm-hmm.
Italy. Also, it was one of the first countries to have. It was a very progressive country back then.
Definitely.
So it was also among the richest countries in Europe. It was basically on par with Sweden and Norway in terms of GDP per capita. It was richer than the UK per capita, I think. So yeah, because it was heavily industrialized. Uh, but communism slowed these two countries down. So
Gotcha. Nice. And then, while we're talking about stuff that's not necessarily in the book, I had something
yeah.
maybe sort of related to it. So I found, I think it was like a New York Times article from 1995.
Mhm.
It was an interview
Mm.
with the author of this
Mm.
Martin, and so he talks about so after after the fall of communism, he founded a publishing company, like
Mm-hmm.
Arca Publishing House, I think.
Arca.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and so he has that, and he's clearly still has a lot of thoughts about politics. And in this book in 1995, he expresses that he's kind of like worried about Slovakia going in an authoritarian direction. Like apparently,
Mm-hmm.
like three TV shows had been banned by the state, like one that was like a political satire show and stuff like that. And I was kind of curious, like obviously maybe this is obviously when you were quite young, but have you heard, like when you were growing up, did you ever hear anything sort of like that, like it during 95 and around that time that there
Mm-hmm.
was like almost like maybe a bit of a swing back away from liberalism or something?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, so the 90s were very much a dark age for
Oh, gotcha.
Slovakia. It was horrible back then, man. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. But so once the old order collapsed, when any type of order collapses, chaos ensues.
Yeah.
Um, so this is what happened in Slovakia as well. And it was the 90s were wild because the mafia had a lot of power back then. People who it to me it seems like this criminal element was suppressed by the state so successfully during communism that it just came with a fucking vengeance
Mm-hmm.
after that
Yep.
after 1993. And cars were blowing up. The son of one president, he got kidnapped
My
by
goodness.
his political opponent, because yeah, yeah, yeah. So his political opponent, he had the secret service under his rule basically, and he ordered them to kidnap his son, and they carried him over to Austria, and they just dumped him somewhere on like a gas station or something. They found him. He was beat up and he had his hands tied and stuff. Yeah, and this was the president's son. This is like if someone, I don't know, um, kidnapped, Jesus, I don't know, Ivanka Trump or
My
something.
goodness. This shit's happening in Slovakia at like the same time Bill Clinton's getting shit for getting a blowjob in the Oval Office. Like, oh my god.
Yeah, yeah, it was a dark time for Slovakia. So Madeleine Albright, who was of Czech descent, actually, she was I think she was like a foreign minister of the U.S. essentially. I think at that time she had a bunch of different um, functions in the administration, but she was like a higher ranked politician, Madeleine Albright. She wrote a couple books. You probably know her. And she said that Slovakia is the black hole of Europe in the 1990s. So yeah,
Interesting.
it was politically, it was a hard time, but this story has a good ending because in 1998, they, there was this political power that managed to dodge this authoritarian guy who was getting his grip onto power. He was a nationalist. He was something like Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Mm.
Maybe you're familiar with him, sort of or not. He was like the Trump of 1990, I think, in Slovakia. Let's say it was like these authoritarian he had this authoritarian side to him. He didn't give a shit about people.
Hmm.
He wanted everybody to be loyal to him, to succumb to his will, and all of that. So
Hmm.
it was very much dangerous at that time. Yeah, so something like that. Like I think that's about the closest example I could fathom from the
Gotcha.
U.S. But yeah, it was wild. However, from 1998, it all turned out good. We
Hmm.
entered NATO and then the EU, and so it's a success story overall.
Gotcha. Nice. Awesome. That's just interesting that it's like at least compared to like how I think about U.S. history, like that's very recent. Like
Hmm.
I have this like
Oh
it's
yeah.
probably just because I'm relatively young, I suppose, but I think of yeah, the 90s aren't that long ago. We're not like that necessarily different, even though we
Yep.
probably are in a lot of ways. But it's just really interesting that that's that recent for a lot of violence and stuff like that in Slovakia.
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
Oh yeah, it was horrible. My parents don't talk to me about this. I haven't talked to them about this, but I read about this a lot. in books, and it's something that we look back to really culturally,
Hmm.
and we try to figure it out, like what the hell was happening in the 90s, like what was that all about? And this was the case for Czech Republic as well. Slovakia was a worse example because the particular politician here was more authoritarian than in the Czech Republic,
Hmm.
and Czech Republic had stronger institutions back then. But yeah, like cars were blowing up in Prague as well and stuff. So
Gotcha.
it was a crazy time to be in politics or in public life.
Yeah, car
Yeah.
bombs were a big thing back in the 90s. Like, I've heard of it a
Yeah.
lot in relation to like the IRA in Ireland,
Oh
the
yeah. Oh
separatists.
yeah.
That was massive too.
Jesus.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're past that.
Yeah, definitely.
All
That was a horrible time, man. Yeah.
right, let me see here
Slovakia.
if I've got other points I wanted to bring up here about the actual book before we get too far off topic. Let me see
Yep.
here.
Definitely.
Was oh yeah, so there's one particular scene that I wrote a note about. It was I think it's early on in the book, and uh, he's like in his bedroom cuddling up with Tanya, and so he like they somehow get on the topic of him running and his trophies and stuff that are hanging in the
Mm-hmm.
room, and he gets
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
into it, and you can see like it's a full like almost like a Saint Paul paragraph, right? Like if you read like one of like some of Saint Paul's epistles in the Bible, where it'll be like one sentence that runs for like 3 pages, right? It was a lot like that. He's getting into it. He's like running through. He'd be like, "Yeah, this is what it would be like. I'd be running, and then I'd be really getting into it, and you'd be cheering, and then I'd finish, and I'd want to die, and it would be fantastic." And he kind of finishes, and he realizes he got off track, and Tanya's just like, "Yep," and he's like, "Yeah, I'll throw my trophies out tomorrow." And I'm like, "That's so sad." Like, just like he's like, "Man, I loved this so much," and then he's like, "Well, yeah, I can't go to university. I'm not going to be competing at any sort of level now. So I better.
Yeah.
It's better that I just throw those things away." And I'm like, wow, it was a really powerful scene.
Yeah, I remember that scene too. And so I've read one other book that it's basically a book that's a book of like it's an interview with the author. It came
Mm.
out in 2019, and he remembers a lot of these times, and he remembers the time he wrote this book, and he says that so back then I was very boastful, and to a weird degree to which I am ashamed of.
Yeah.
He said that he boasted more than he really needed to. Because he wanted to show that he's a good runner. He wanted to
Hmm.
express that. And so this was his channel, but he said that I didn't have to do that. It's kind of
Yeah.
boastful.
Yeah, I got it. I got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Like particularly if you're like super, you're like one of the best in your country at this, and
Yeah,
then you just can't do it
yeah,
anymore, even though you're still the
yeah.
best. Like I'd be really pissed off too. I'd like every
He
chance
was,
I'd get, I'd be like sprinting past people, being like, "This is what you're missing out on, bitch." Like,
yeah. He was actually his trainers actually told him that they want to nominate him for the Olympics.
mm-hmm.
But since he was the son of a dissident,
Not gonna
the
happen.
communist regime couldn't have it. No,
Mm-mm.
no.
Gosh, that's just so shitty. Like personally, like I guess
Yeah.
maybe with the Olympics, you can make a point that that should be different. But I've always been under the impression like I don't give a shit what like an athlete is like, right? Like even so like the O.J. Simpson trial, right? Guy clearly murders his wife, gets away with it, obviously, but it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but he was still really good at football. Like we can still say that, right, guys? And like, and like all this stuff, like athletes not getting vaccinated and stuff like this, and it ends up being such an uproar nowadays. It's like, guys, I
Oh yeah.
watched this person bounce a ball and make shots, and he's really good at it. Like, why do I care? It's just so
Yeah.
nonsensical to me. But yeah, I mean, I suppose I could maybe see it for the Olympics, like you're representing your country, I guess. But I don't know.
Yeah, they just couldn't have it, because his father, actually, the story about his father is very interesting too. He was a very devout communist back in the 50s,
Mm,
and he was one of the leading communists in the country, actually. However, in the 60s, basically, after some time, he realized that, uh-oh, this is not what we wanted to build. You
Mm-hmm.
know, back then they wanted justice for everybody. They wanted social justice for people, and this sort of and they wanted to they wanted a different system from what democracy was, because they blamed democracy for Second World War, which is a bad sort of thinking, I think. But they blamed democracy for the Second World War, and they wanted something else. They wanted some change, and a change is what they got. And he
Gotcha.
realized he was wrong, and he tried to he tried to criticize the party, and the party imprisoned him. So yeah,
Gotcha.
not good.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's a common narrative for a lot of people who are like political dissidents in any sort of fashion, right? So if you're
Yeah.
like, say you're, in America during any of these revolutions, I feel like when you're revolutionary, you can be really carefree with your rhetoric and you're making all these, but as soon as it comes to like actually setting up some sort of system, then you're getting all these players coming in wanting a piece of the pie or to get special treatment, and you
Hmm.
realize that setting this up is extremely difficult compared to how easy it is to make kind of broad rhetoric. And I think that's pretty common for no matter what system's in there, it gets captured by certain bad actors,
Hmm.
things like that.
Yeah.
So
Precisely. Precisely. And that's what democracy prevents. And yeah, because like no matter how well you mean, it always turns to shit if it's an authoritarian state. Because the bad people
mm-hmm.
get on top. It's just what happens. But a thought just popped into my mind right now. You know what I think really makes him an exceptional author? I think that really exceptional authors are sort of ahead of the curve every time, a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
somehow. It's not really, and it's the nature of being ahead, like they are, is not exactly factual. It's sort of on an emotional level. It's not based on data. It's not based on some predictive algorithm that they've
Yep.
created. It's based on a feeling, and really great authors have this sort of feeling. There was George Orwell with when he wrote 1984, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Huxley when he wrote his books. That was who else? Tony Judd, for example, a great intellectual as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think like great writers are always ahead of the curve, and they think differently. They just think in this more authentic sense, this more sensitive way, and that's what allows them to be ahead of the curve. And we have a saying in Slovakia: you have your finger on the what do you call
On a
this,
pulse.
on the pulse. Yeah, you have your finger on the pulse of that particular era.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what he had back then, and after the collapse of communism as well, as a public intellectual. So I think this is something that makes him an exceptional writer. It's a shame he doesn't have more books in English. I don't think he does, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Anyways,
Awesome. All right, let me see. I think that's all the points I have written down. Let me see. Did I get through all the article stuff that I had? Oh yeah. So the foreword in this book is by Václav Havel. Was he the
the English
Yeah? Was he the first president of Slovakia, or am I thinking wrong here?
of Czechoslovakia. Yeah.
Czechoslovakia. Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
he was the first president. He's a huge public intellectual as well. He has like a prestigious prize named after him that's
Gotcha. I
given
thought I'd heard the
internationally.
name before for sure. Like I definitely know that I've
Yeah,
heard Václav Havel, but I couldn't remember if it was like the name of a town in Star Wars or something.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that forward isn't in the book that I have. It's only in the English version
Oh,
of it,
gotcha. Yep.
because the publisher thought, I've read about it in this other book. The publisher thought that it's going to sell if Václav Havel writes the forward,
Hmm.
and I guess it did. Um, so yeah, he died in like 2011, was it, or 2012, something like that. Yeah,
Gotcha.
it was. The Czechs mourn him very much this day.
I'd imagine for sure.
Yeah.
All right, gotcha. Well, any other points you've got here? Otherwise, I think we got through all mine.
Yeah. we got through all mine as well. Like the real important point that this book sort of managed to nail down with me was the paradoxical simplicity of his life back then. You know, like he was going about his business, and like you mentioned, he wasn't really putting a lot of attention to criticizing the communist regime. But if you paid close attention, you noticed that in some parts of the book, he actually goes into this rage, and he expresses his rage towards communist the regime with swear words, which he doesn't use in other instances. If you paid close attention, he only uses swear words in relation to the regime. He always says, this fucking regime won't allow me this or
Mm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about the only time he uses swear words of this magnitude, let's say.
Mm.
And but I think it's a result of this exhaustion from the regime as well. It's like you almost give up on criticizing it, because it doesn't make any it's not worth it to criticize it if it's not going to collapse. This is the reality I live in. You just get on with your life, and you're just like, fuck it, and you express your occasional dissatisfaction with it by swearing at it and waving your fist at the rule. But that's all you can do, and you just sort of sigh, and you go on with your life, and you realize that it doesn't make that it's not worth it to pay more attention to it than that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, with the it's just like a lot of what's a good way of saying it? Like for instance, a lot of people online in particular, they'll like talk about like the U.S. system, for example. Right, that's gonna be what I'm gonna get most to. But when there's an exasperation with it, there's this like escalatory, heavy-handed rhetoric of listen and I don't. It's like it's completely different, obviously, right? Because it's a completely different regime, but it's very hot-headed rhetoric that people are bringing in back and forth, and they're always out to kind of exaggerate the system because they say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
if I use heavier and heavier and more inflammatory language to describe this, maybe some people will pay attention. And I don't think that's a very good way of thinking about it. And this book kind of places that for me, right? Because it's you can tell there's not really much exaggeration and stuff like that when he talks about it. But there's still some very pointed critiques and stuff like that in here. And I think that lack of exaggeration, just saying how it is, um, I think it kind of is more likely to have an impact, if that makes sense, than
Mm-hmm.
escalating and using more and more inflammatory
Mm-hmm.
rhetoric, because that can give people the idea of, hey, well, I mean, if you're just going to be straight up lying and using this sort of language now, I don't think if we make anything better, you're going to stop. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think this book kind of locks that in for me, and it's kind of along those same lines. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So what's one thing that you really take away from this book? Apart from this, what's like the number one thing that you're going to remember after reading this?
I think the number one thing that I'm going to take that I kind of take away from this book is I don't know. It's almost a little hopeful, um, because with a lot of like the media that I consume and things like that end up being around current events or breaking news or like a news podcast and things like that I tend to listen to. Um, I think it's very easy to get wrapped up in it and get maybe a little bit depressed on, oh, things aren't moving in politics in the right way, right? Things aren't moving in culture the right way or ways that I would like them to. And I think this book kind of gives me a little bit more peace on that in a couple of ways. One, you can live under a terrible regime and you can still live a simple life and have
Mm-hmm.
some great experiences, and things like that. Um, and life continues, right? And it hit like U.S. big history with slavery, And overall, right,
Hmm.
that doesn't necessarily mean that for every slave at every point in history, like their lives were just constantly about this oppression. Maybe that wasn't their focus. They went home, had dinner with their family, brought up children, same thing, right? And I think kind of bringing in focus on a more simple section of my life and kind of like this isn't going to change no matter what happens with current events and culture and things like that. Um, this is kind of going to be like a place of refuge almost. That brings
Hmm.
me a whole lot of peace, and that and kind of looking at things in the long term, right? Because this is a book written 40 years ago, and things were pretty bad, but things aren't as bad now. And so I think taking the long view and stuff like that, it kind of brings me a whole lot of peace and doesn't let me get wrapped up too much in current rhetoric and arguments and stuff like that. So yeah,
Hmm. Nice.
for sure. All right. See. Oh, let's see. I thought I had something percolating in my brain. Let me see if I can pull it out before I had it. Uh, oh yeah, the other thing. I think after reading this, I like. I think I'm just gonna write some more stream of consciousness stuff. I think it's interesting. Like if you can
Hmm.
kind of block yourself off and do it. Like the hard part for me, right, is nowadays you write on a computer. I purposely got
Hmm.
this really crappy laptop from 2009. And so, like, it can barely process anything, right? And so I open it, and you can just use the word processor. And so I got it, and so I love writing on that thing because it's very easy to disconnect myself and be like, okay, I'm just gonna be here and I'm gonna write what my thoughts at this
It's
moment are.
it's your typewriter essentially.
Exactly.
It's
You're
your
not
digital typewriter.
exactly. You're not gonna be as it's not as easy access to be like, I don't know what have other people said on this subject. It's like Brian,
Hmm.
who gives a shit? All right, I want to know what I think about this. I don't
Hmm.
want to pull points from other people and just parrot them and shit them out on a page. So I think I think that's another thing that I'm gonna start trying to do more. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you write your short stories on?
Yeah, usually they're kind of they're usually fiction. Right now, I'm trying to do
Hmm.
it's a short collection of stories where the characters all know they're in a story, kind of meta like that. And so
Hmm.
I think I've got 3 of them written so far. One of them I've still got to do some proofreading on, but I think I want to get like 5 stories so I can have a collection. Because if you put out one short story, it would be very
Hmm.
hard to say publish. But a collection of short stories, where
Hmm.
it can get to maybe the size of a novella or something like that,
Okay.
could be
Hmm.
pretty good. But they're all fiction. They usually have some sort of lesson in them, but it's kind of framed in an interesting meta way like that. I don't know why I really like writing about that concept of like knowing that you're in a story and maybe you don't have control, but there's still a
Hmm.
story here, and maybe it relates to the outside world in some way. It's just an interesting concept for me. But yeah, so that's
Where do
usually
you
what I write.
set it?
Oh, where do
Where
I
do you
set it?
set it? It's set.
Yeah,
Yep.
so usually I'll kind of the setting for me typically ends up being like a very like parody version of the generic setting for a certain genre, right? So I have one that's like a pulp noir detective, right? So, uh, you
Hmm.
know, there she was, the femme fatale, started into my office. Her legs were so long, kind of that era of like a dark detective novel. And so the world for that, the setting is a completely over the top generic parody version of that world. I have one that takes place in a high fantasy world, and so everything that happens is what happens in generic fantasy novels. Um, and stuff like
Hmm.
that. At least for 2 of them, that's kind of where it comes from. Um, there's a little bit uh, of like a parody element to them as well, where it's like, yeah, this happens in every single detective novel, right? So, yeah.
Interesting. I'd like to read them one day if you manage to send them to me, maybe or
Yeah,
something if you'd like.
yeah. I'll send over the ones that I have. I've been sending them around to different people for proofreading, so that would definitely be good. I'll send you
Mm.
some links after this and get that in there. Other than that, I suppose we can probably wrap the podcast here. So, real quick, I'll remember to put down links in the description. Hopefully, if I don't, email me and give me crap for it. But I'll put down some links in the description for the book we're reading, maybe like the author's wiki page or something like that, um, and just all the other generic stuff. So, that's it. Thanks for coming on again, Tim. And I'll quit the recording here. Tim has
Okay.
brought to my attention that we probably should say whether or not we recommend this book. Maybe not give it a review score. I'm going to give it one of those dumb review scores that always happens in review videos.
All
So
right, go on.
I would definitely recommend this book for anybody, particularly if you're interested in short stories or just beautifully written prose, right? Might not be for you. It's autobiographical, so if you're interested in nonfiction, it's probably up there too. But I would give this book, I'd say I'm gonna give it 4.5 out of 5 smashed toads. That's what I'm gonna give it. Uh, if you read the book, you'll probably figure out what that one means. But would you like to give your recommendations and thoughts, Tim?
That's a beautiful way to put this. Yeah, I remember that image very vividly.
Yeah.
Smashed toads there. It was wonderful. Yeah, he described them as popping balloons. So yeah.
Hmm.
Anyways, the I would definitely recommend this book. He is this author Martin Milan Šimečka. He is one of my favorite public intellectuals in the Slovak public life right now, and I really do admire his courage to put his thoughts down on paper like he did, and like he does to this day. He has a couple more books, but none of those are in English to my knowledge. He has a sequel to the Year of the Frog, but it's called Interest, but it's only in Slovak. Perhaps someone should get on that and translate it
Yeah, come on.
to English. Yeah, come on.
No worries, I'll get on it.
So
I'm gonna learn Slovak. Let's do
yeah.
it.
Yeah. So I would definitely recommend it to anybody who would like to learn more about the sort of mindset that people lived in communist times, people who opposed the regime. And this could be also interesting to people who enjoy reading books about introspection, or about or for people who have a rich inner world and like to understand other people who have a rich inner world as well. And I think there's a lot of relatable things like for these types of uh, people in the book. So definitely recommend, and I would give this a 4.5 smashed toads out of 5. Let's go with the same uh,
I
as
like
you
it.
did, Brian.
Great minds think alike. Heck yeah. All right, awesome. Go out and buy the book. Oh.